Semester number 1, lesson number 42. Our aim today is why did labor unions begin to develop during the late 19th century? And to start off, I want you to critically think about employees, right? And maybe you are an employee, and maybe you are in a union, all right? When employees are upset about something at work, what are the different steps they can take to improve their position? So we're thinking now not about the protection of one person, but a group of people working in an employment situation, all right? And we're going to talk about that more today. We're going to focus on industrialization and government regulations, the rise of labor unions. And to get us started, we're going to talk about steps towards government regulation. All right. There were periods of downturns in the national economy. The economy was struggling at points, and there was a growing criticism over the practices of big business. What we've been talking about the last few days, right? Monopolies and how they were hurting the people, right? Monopolies were profiting at the expense of the poor and working class. People were stuck paying absorbent amounts of money for oil and steel and whatnot, and because there was no competition. And when there's no competition, what's the incentive for these companies to lower the prices? They had no incentive because there was no competition, and therefore in the end it hurt the people. All right? And politicians started to really say, we need to change this. We can't have these few people like these Carnegies and these Rockefellers controlling all this money when there's so many people in this country that are incredibly poor because of it. All right, and the argument against government regulation is very simple. People said some people said the government can't get involved. Remember, we learned yesterday or the other day about laissez-faire economics and hands-off government, hands-off policies where the government cannot get involved in the economics of the country. So it was a really tough situation because the government didn't want to overstep its boundaries because in capitalism they really shouldn't. But the people were struggling, and the most important thing, if we talk about it all year, the most important thing that the government's supposed to protect is the people. So as we go, let's look at the protecting the interest of small business. How do we make sure that small businesses are protected? And when we talk about protected, meaning they're not being abused, and the people aren't being abused by one company controlling an entire industry. And in order to look at this, it's important to look at two acts passed by the federal government, which, question how much they were really getting involved. They kind of were, but to make sure that these businesses did not take advantage of the people and small businesses. The first is the Interstate Commerce Act, all right? And the Interstate Commerce Act set precedent for federal regulation of business between states. So whenever there was business going on in more than one state, this gave the government the power to limit it and regulate it, make sure that they weren't doing anything fishy or illegal. And the more important one is the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act made monopolies and trusts illegal, except in situations such as the ones we talked about, like the MTA and Con Edison. All right, it made monopolies illegal. It did not allow one company to be in control of a very large percentage of everything in one industry. All right, and the present day example that we discussed, or that we have discussed in the past, is Microsoft. All right, in the mid 90s, Microsoft controlled almost all of the computer products in terms of operating systems in the United States. Not only did they control most of that, they forced their browser, Internet Explorer, on those operating systems, and that was considered to be an example of a trust and monopoly, something that the Sherman Antitrust Act does not allow. All right, so they had to pay an exorbitant fine, and they had to separate their companies into two. So we also need to look at the rise of labor organizations protecting the workers from bad conditions. All right, and when we talk about protecting the workers from bad conditions, some of the conditions that existed at this time were 16-hour workdays, child labor, very low pay. So labor organizations resulted from poor working conditions, and the point of these labor organizations was to protect the worker and make sure they were getting their rights. All right, and there was two early labor organizations which were very similar and different, in certain ways. All right, both of these organizations were looking to protect workers' rights. However, the Knights of Labor was the more general one that that labor was made up of both skilled and unskilled workers. And by skilled, I mean they had a trade, and unskilled means they didn't really have a trade. All right? What the Knights of Labor did is they fought for the 8-hour workday, an end to child labor, and equal opportunity and wages for women. All right? The AFL, on the other hand, they were like the higher end. They were a labor union of skilled laborers only, so electricians, carpenters, steel workers, all right? And they fought for better wages, hours, and working conditions as well. And the leader of the AFL was a man named Samuel Gompers on the right, all right? And he wanted to protect the working class, the workers. Some of these labor conflicts got very, very serious and deadly, all right? And there's a few here, and in the end, these labor conflicts actually hurt the workers because they painted them in a poor light, all right? The Haymarket riot in 1886 was a labor rally that ended with a bomb blast and riot, many killed, including 7 police officers. The Homestead Strike was a protest by Andrew Carnegie's steelworkers. 16 were killed during violent protests, and it ended the union movement in the steel industry for 20 years. It made them look so bad that, they didn't have a union or union talks for 20 years. And the Pullman Strike, President Grover Cleveland sent in troops to end the strike. This showed that the government favored business over laborers, all right? Laborers, and this is a problem, right? When we talk about early labor conflicts, the labor unions were not incredibly organized, and they were kind of crazy, and there wasn't real, there wasn't peaceful protesting. There was a lot of violence, and it made them look bad. And because of that, the federal government always sided with the business, meaning they had a real advantage. We'll talk more about this tomorrow, and we will have your discussion question, all right? And then we will have the check for understanding. When policy can be attributed to the success of the which policy can be attributed to the success of the American Federation of Labor in the late 19th century? A, supporting candidates of its own political party. B, focusing on gains in wages and working conditions. C, using violence to combat big corporations. Or D, allowing only steel workers into the unions. And we will talk more about that tomorrow in class. Have a good night.